Hello, everyone, and welcome to 360 Feedback Best Practices to Fuel Success. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll take care of a few housekeeping items and introductions. I'm Jessie Beringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat function throughout the presentation. We'll be answering as many of your questions as we can at the end in a Q&A session. Joining me to discuss 360 Feedback Best Practice is 3D Group President, Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is the founder of 3D Group and a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, leadership development, and 360 feedback. Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals and an author and co-editor of the recently released Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. In addition to designing custom 360 feedback systems for clients, Dr. Rose personally coaches leaders in focused post-360 feedback sessions. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level from board chair to first-line supervisor. He's also a frequent contributor to publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, CEO World, and HR.com. And with that, I'll hand it over to you to get us started, Dale.
Thank you, Jessie, and thank you all for joining me today to spend a little time talking about my favorite subject, 360 feedback. Always love this opportunity, and look forward to kind of going through a few of the areas where I feel best practices should be highlighted. I will say I'm going to probably hit on about 6 different key areas. In our benchmark study, which we have a new version of coming out fairly soon, there are about 23, I think, different decisions you get to make when you're trying to go through this. So it can be a pretty involved process and a lot of steps to take, but I'm going to try to hit on the 3 big ones. I'll start with a little bit of an opening around just kind of thinking about what 360 feedback is and what the impacts are. So, the bottom line is 360 feedback has an impact on businesses. When you use 360 feedback, particularly when you use it well, you're going to get positive results. This was a study that we did a number of years ago where we looked at a retail organization, large box kind of retail, and looked at retail store sales for those retail managers that scored high versus those that scored low, and there was about a $5 million annual revenue difference in the two groups. So we're seeing just straight away, and this is particularly true in retail organizations where there really is kind of a dollar impact of the kind of floor level management. So we're seeing some positive scores just on a simple basis. A much more involved and candidly more academically rigorous study was done a few years back now in the Journal of Applied Psychology, kind of the top journal in industrial psychology, peer-reviewed journal, where they looked at an in-depth analysis of 250 or so companies and real complicated meta-analysis. But at the end of the day, they looked at it and said, look, what we're seeing is a positive impact by the use of 360 feedback on workforce productivity, and specifically that it predicted workforce productivity. So the bottom line is that we know it makes a difference in organizations that, and it isn't rocket science to think, okay, if you can help improve leaders within your organization, you're going to have a better run organization that's going to get better results for the company, for the shareholders, et cetera. I do want to also introduce our benchmark study and some examples there. So our benchmarking study, we've been doing this for 20 years. We've got over 600 companies worth of data in there. I was off. It's 22 design considerations. And what we really did when we put this study together, I recommend you look at it if you're designing a study or designing a program. It goes sort of step by step into all the different things that you got to consider and gives you an idea of what's going on out in the industry around how companies choose to do 360s. We've got a book on like what what the ideal is, but it's also really valuable just to see what a company's actually doing. And so that was the intent of this tool when we first started it over 20 years ago, and I think it continues to add value in that way for many, many companies. Well, in our most recent study, we asked a simple question around what business metrics do you see it impacting? And what we found was these two really stood out, that HR leaders really felt increased retention of high potentials was critical. We know high potentials don't like feedback poor environments. They want feedback, they want to get better. And without feedback, it's going to be very hard to do that. And they want honest feedback. They want honest feedback that can help push them to be better and improve as leaders. So, one core area in terms of the kind of business impact you're going to see is around retention of those high potential leaders. The other thing is just better decision making by leaders. So getting honest, one of the things they say is very difficult the higher up you go in an organization to get honest information and honest feedback. People tend to be very careful about how they present information and provide feedback. So the higher up you go in an organization, the harder it is to really know how you're doing, what impact you're having on others, and then to make decisions about how do you tweak that style. Am I being overbearing and micromanaging from their perspective, or do I need to give them more autonomy? Do they need more support because I'm giving them too much autonomy? Very hard to find that out. Very hard to get that kind of information direct face to face. So honest anonymous feedback in a 360 process is going to do it. Well, just a quick overview on what is 360 feedback? What does it look like? Where does it come from? Typical workplace feedback is you do get feedback from your manager. So there's a little bit of, roll the dice. You get one of these to be your manager. So which one do you want it to be? They're going to give you all the feedback about how you're doing in your job. I think you could argue there's pros and cons to each one of these. I've got my own preference, but again, we all have had different managers at different times, and having that one individual have an outsized impact on your development and your career may not be optimal. So 360-degree feedback developed out of this notion of diversifying the perspectives that you get about how you're leading, and that it not just be sort of a top-down view from one individual. And so it's shifted to this kind of paradigm where the person in the middle is the feedback recipient. Back in the early 90s, they used to be called targets, which is a little bit dark, but this is the person getting feedback. And sure, they're going to get feedback from that one supervisor, but they're also going to hear from their peers. They're going to hear from their direct reports. And then often there's another group that could be folks they've worked with recently in terms of, on large initiatives, on maybe their internal business partners that really they rely on. So that other group's a little bit more flexible. And the key idea here is that you have multiple, first of all, there's lots of folks in here, right? So you've got, 9, 8, 13 people giving you feedback, not just the one. You've got, within each group, you also have a little bit of variability. So one of my favorites is the guy down there in the other group, right? Like you've got 3 people who seem pretty happy, but one guy not so happy. And so hearing kind of all those voices blended and balancing each other out, and you ought to be in a good feedback report, be able to kind of not know who said what. Certainly it needs to be anonymous, but you ought to at least have the voice of the grumpy guy down there so that you can respond to it and reflect it in the way you're leading. But again, if that happens to be the one person you're getting feedback from, not quite as useful. So multiple sources and larger number of folks is kind of the bottom line. The other thing, and we've kind of put our stake in the ground in terms, my colleagues and I and other authors and experts in this space, to say, 360 feedback shows up as a lot of different ways. One of my favorite examples, and I'm not kidding, is there is a commercially available tool that calls itself as a 360 feedback assessment that asks us a question, among others. If Dale was a dog, what breed of dog would he be? And lists out 20 different dogs. I would argue that's not 360 feedback. That's something very, very strange. And so, and then there's the notion of doing interviews. Are those 360 feedback? Well, we've gone in and done a definition. I'm not going to belabor you with the details of that definition. I recommend you to pick up the article and read it if you're interested. But we said, look, it boils down to it needs to be quantitative. It needs to be a quantitative survey that allows you to get numeric data from each of those different groups we just saw, so you can compare them and say, oh, this peer group sees me, for example, as following through on commitments, but my direct reports do not. That's very difficult, maybe impossible to do in many of the other kind of pseudo feedback tools. You also need to get feedback relevant to workplace behavior. Breed of dog, not relevant to the workplace. In fact, if anything, it's going to turn me off as a leader to ignore this instrument rather than bring me into going, oh, I really do need to follow through in commitments. That's very relevant to my workplace. And if my peers don't feel like I'm doing that, I probably need to pay attention to it. And then, as we talked about, multiple feedback sources. So we would argue that these are the three basic components that you need to have. And it's valuable to really boil it down to these three. Again, not that, for example, stakeholder interviews aren't valuable added components, not that a personality assessment isn't a valuable added component. But if you're talking about what 360 is specifically, these are the three we would recommend you focus on. I like to make it tangible a little bit. What does it look like? Something like this, a survey on, how effective is this person at listening to others attentively? And then you get results that show an average score. And there's lots of different ways to present results. I'm just oversimplifying a bit. And you can look at, well, how well am I listening to others? And for example, in these data, you can see pretty clearly that right here, the direct report feels the person's not listening to others as well as, say, the manager. And that may in fact be accurate. It could very well be. Those different views are not necessarily a source of variance to eliminate. It could be that actually you do listen to your manager more than you listen to your direct reports, and maybe you have an opportunity to increase that with your direct report team. So this is kind of what we're looking at, is a simple survey given to those raters with a quantitative, the ability to quantify these ratings and then report them out on a by group basis. So who uses the 360 feedback? So here's what I'm going to first draw on my benchmark data. So fundamentally, you do see 360 used at multiple different levels. It's an oversimplified org chart. So, at that kind of executive, vice president and above level, you definitely see it. At that mid-med level, director, manager kind of level, you see it being used. And then also can be used for individual contributors. We will often see, and I've got these color-coded, slightly different content at that executive level, and then that mid-market or mid-manager level, and certainly the individual contributor level. There wouldn't be anything, for example, on delegation for that group, but there would be for the mid-manager and the executive. The executive might have more things around developing strategy. The director or mid-market may be more about executing strategy. So just slight differences in content. What we see in our data on the benchmark data is that really that mid-level manager is one of the biggest targets. That's kind of the sweet spot for helping leaders develop. But you can see it is used across all these different sources based on the data that we're seeing. One fundamental element of feedback that's also very different from most other assessments, which again you miss in like stakeholder interviews, is the ability to understand yourself, right? So self-awareness is kind of at the crux, the idea that I might see myself differently than others. I might see myself as listening to others perfectly all the time. I'm listening to others. What do you mean? Well, it turns out that I see it that way, but maybe my direct reports don't. So I like to use this example to kind of help illustrate what rating could be like. So let's take a look, for example, at this apple. So just take a minute and think about this apple. And if you don't like apples, imagine it's a fruit you do like, a cantaloupe perhaps. And rate this apple. So if you're going to rate this apple from 1 to 5, where 5 is like best apple I've ever seen, mouth-watering, can't wait to take a bite of that apple. 1 is not so much, love apples, but this one doesn't look like I want to eat. Where would you rate this apple? Looks pretty good to me, but again, I'm not one to judge. So what I would say is that you're able to rate this apple. Let's say you give this apple a 4. I don't know, there could be some room for improvement. From the perspective you have, this apple's a 4. But if you rotate this apple around, you might make a different rating. So this, I think, illustrates this idea that depending on your perspective, you may see a different leader. And so the key is 360 feedback provides an opportunity for leaders to see those different perspectives and then take action on what can I do to improve. I'm not sure what you could do to improve this particular apple, but hopefully the point is made. So of course, awareness is important, but it's also not enough. So this manager likely has uh, pretty good awareness that she's maybe being a bottleneck on a few things, and the backlog is there. But knowing that isn't going to make the difference. What's going to make the difference is acceptance. She needs to accept, okay, this is something I need to change. And when she accepts that, that's where she's going to move to change. So you can make someone aware of where their opportunities for growth are, but until they accept it, it won't really work. So I'm going to illustrate sort of the model that we use to think about 360 feedback, and shortly we'll get into some data here on some key areas. So fundamentally, there are kind of three big things. First, awareness. Oh, okay, I do need to work on this thing. I'll use my behavioral example. I don't listen as well to my direct reports as I probably should. I see. Well, no, actually, I'm jumping ahead. I'm already accepting. I'm aware that my direct reports think that I don't listen, but I may still think that I do listen, and they just have it wrong. Um, that leaves me a gap to get to the action planning that we know is needed to get to behavior change. So it's pretty important to fill in that gap with these two pieces. So I can be aware that my direct reports, I can look at the thing and say, my direct reports say that I don't listen, but I do, until I accept, okay, actually, if they think I'm not listening, then that's probably as important of whether I'm thinking, and maybe I need to adjust my behavior. Okay, I get it. Now I can create a plan on how to make that change. But even the best laid plans, as we know, pretty much every January, people make great plans on how they're going to change and improve. But without some level of accountability, it's very difficult to get to that behavior change. So we recommend that when you're looking at your 360 process, you think about good, solid survey data, good, solid reports that are going to increase awareness, be easy to read, but also build in steps to help people get to that acceptance before you ask them to create a development plan. And once they've made that development plan, make sure there's some form of accountability in there, whether it's a coach or a manager or HR, to check in and say, hey, how's it going on that? And follow up. And that's what's actually going to lead you to behavior change. Okay, so let's get started on some of these key dimensions. One thing to realize is that when you do get started and you're trying to design a process like this, there are a bunch of steps you got to ask. It's the questions you got to ask yourself. One is who's participant? Who's going to get feedback? Who in my company needs feedback? Well, they all need feedback, but it may be that you're going to prioritize a certain group over another. So you got to ask that question. And then there's a couple other questions. Who should get the report? Who owns the report? How does HR fit into this? Is it a custom survey, off the shelf? Is it, I'm at this point, it's too many, right? So this is a pretty good list of some of the things that you got to think about. As I mentioned, there's at least 22. But as soon as you start asking the question, who should participate, then you start asking how, all these other things are going to start coming into play. And so we try to kind of boil it down to what are the key things that are going to make the biggest difference where you really do need to focus. So what are those essential design features? What are the key things you need to think about? So the first one, and I kind of highlighted this a little bit, relevant content, right? Don't ask about dog breeds. Don't ask about cats. Ask about listening, asking about following up on behavior. Actionable, relevant behaviors. And ideally, behaviors that people are going to connect to. I was just working with a client yesterday where we are trying to discuss what their content would be, and they have these organizational values that are really behavioralized more than just kind of values. And they said, well, everybody loves these. They're really keyed into them, and it makes sense to everybody. Great. Let's build a tool around those because there's already some energy and emphasis on it. So they've got to be clear. They've got to be actionable. They've got to be relevant. Start with content there. Second piece is you got to be able to collect credible data. So if I get a report and the wrong people were invited, I've actually worked with a leader one time that got a report and said, oh, yeah, I don't know 3 of the people that are on here. Turned out that HR had chosen his raters and they chose poorly. Very hard to create change, right? Well, how am I going to get to acceptance if I have the wrong people providing feedback? Additionally, you got to build in anonymity. You have to be clear with people that no one is going to know, except of course the vendor, et cetera. But no one's going to know who said what. No one's going to know who provided this rating for this person. They might know these 4 people were peers and that average score of the peers was X, Y, or Z, but they won't know what Bob, Joe, Jane, or Jim said in their responses. Super critical. And then lastly, that piece that I talked about, accountability. So generally, some kind of follow-up, we really highly recommend that you involve the manager in the development process, ideally approving the raters on the upfront, a little bit of a review, and then some sort of follow-up check-in on what did you learn from your feedback, what are you going to do with it, et cetera. And then often, we see folks using feedback coaches that can spend just an hour with them helping to put their feedback in context and kind of create that plan. It both helps with acceptance and with accountability. So these are some components. I would say these 3 legs of this stool are where you need to start. There are more other elements that are key. So let me jump into what those 6 really specific things are that I would say are the best practices in terms of where the most successful 360 programs come about. So one of the first things is to be clear about purpose. Why are people doing this? So why are people involved in this program? In our benchmark study, we asked this question, why are you, how is the feedback used? What are you using it for? What is that purpose? Resoundingly, for all these years, we didn't ask it the first year, which was in 2002. Resoundingly, development is a critical component of the tool. So that is a core purpose, right? So we see broad-based development, career development, linked to training, curriculum, critical. Look at the big drop-off here at succession planning, right? So succession planning is here, drops off to 21%, and that kind of mid-20s throughout. But remarkable consistency across the years. But clearly, these development-oriented areas, much more seen as the key purpose. And these areas like succession planning, performance management, identifying high potentials, links to promotion, pay, that does happen. Companies do that, but much, much less. And then we do see companies that do both, frankly. There's a yes and component to this. But you want to be very clear when someone's participating, why am I doing this? We've literally seen leaders ask, did I get selected to get this feedback because I'm in trouble? Whoa. No. This is for you to develop. This is for you to look at your feedback and figure out how to improve. So if you don't set the purpose clear and loud and repeat your communications about why you're doing this, it will become very, very challenging to have a successful program. So I really recommend that you're clear about purpose, that you repeat it over and over, and that you follow through on those commitments that you make around how that purpose is used. If you are assuring people that their manager will never see the report, don't ever share a report because people will find out quickly and they will not trust the process. If you are sharing the feedback report with the person's manager, be clear about that. Let them know up front. So be clear, why are we doing this? What is the intent? What are people going to get out of it? When people realize this is to help them develop, boy, are they excited to get honest feedback because it's real difficult to get it as a leader. So you do kind of want to consider the big picture too. I talked a little bit about content, that example with the values. If you can link to company strategy or other initiatives that people are really motivated behind, you can get behaviors that fit directly to your company strategy that have to do with operational efficiencies, if that's what's ahead for you, have to do with innovation, if that's what's ahead for you. Think about how you want to communicate this. Communication plan that's done well is often one of the most overlooked things in this process. So you have to be intentional about messaging to your population. What's it for? Why are we doing it? What are the rules of engagement? And over and over and over. Too often people get caught up in building surveys, building building their notification process, what the report's going to look like. They get to launch and they're like, whew, we collected the data, we're done. You got to communicate more than that, that the purpose is more than just, hey, here's a report with some stuff that's interesting. So be clear about your purpose. Second key practice to consider as you're trying to launch this, and while this is true of many programs, the new benefits program wants this. With 360s, it's particularly critical that you get senior level support, right? If you've got a CEO or a top level leader saying, hey, it's critical for our leaders to be looking at themselves, developing, improving, and hearing honest feedback from your colleagues is a great way to do it. And then, dare I suggest it, they actually have received feedback themselves. It's going to make a huge difference in your program. Leaders will follow what they see as valued by senior leadership. So making sure senior leaders are behind it is important, and I would be very careful if you find leaders are really opposed to this process. Occasionally, you run into a leader who's been stung with a poorly implemented process, and they'll just really be down on it, and you really need to sort of start there and chip away at that. Good news is our data suggests that as a general rule, senior level executives are pretty strong advocates of 360 feedback. Even at certainly you would kind of expect the CHRO in there, the chief learning officer, sure. But even the CEO and even to a lesser degree, but that CFO are strong advocates and or at least supportive of the use of 360 feedback. So generally, there's a tailwind out there for you in senior leadership. The question is, at your particular organization, what is that? And I would, before launching and trying to get into any of those micro decisions we were talking about before, I would start by trying to find out what kind of support am I going to get once I launch this? Are my senior executives going to be poo-pooing it, or are they going to be encouraging their direct reports to participate? It'll make a big difference. So I would at least find out and then work a strategy around there. All right, that's the second key area. The third one has to do with content. And I talked about it before, my silly, but also frighteningly accurate example of the dog breeds. The content of the survey is going to make a difference. And so it needs to be, clear, but ideally it's aligned with your organization. It's aligned with the culture, it's aligned with the values, it's aligned with your strategy. Most importantly, it should be aligned with your strategy. So think about what that content is and recognize that it's a message to your leaders about what they need to be doing to be more effective. That can be very, very specific to their situation. We talk about, the culture can be driven through the specific items, because again, people are going to be evaluated on this. They're going to be expected to develop it. So you're really telling people what is valued and what isn't. So just to kind of give an example of what two items might look like. If you see an item like seeks opportunities for process improvements, well, that's helping drive behavior in one particular way. That's a little bit less radical, a little bit less assertive or strong than making transformational changes to benefit the business. So here are kind of two items that could be in a survey that are going to send a really big different message to leaders about what they need to do. We've actually used this second item in an organization where it prompted an unbelievable amount of conversation at all different levels up and down the organization of leaders around, well, what would transformational changes be that would benefit my business? Those conversations, as much as the ratings themselves, drove a lot of behavior among mid and senior level leaders around, wow, how can we transform the business? It just opened up leaders' ideas where they were really stuck in a rut of kind of just, let's just keep, doing what we're doing and keep doing it better, but doing it better a little bit at a time versus, wait, let's really remake this. Made a huge difference in the culture, but also in terms of delivering on the strategy. So recognize that those items that you craft can really have a huge impact. And then especially when you roll them up at a higher level and you see what's going on across the organization. So don't overlook content. if you have an opportunity to customize. There could be some really good off-the-shelf tools that cover kind of basic leadership, and that could be valuable. You can still get good, useful data from that. But if you're trying to shift people's thinking, then I start thinking a little bit more around customizing with that change in mind. Another big one that relates to content is has to do with also the survey and length. So it turns out that we're going to recommend 70 questions or less. A lot of times people go 70 question survey. Oh my goodness, that just seems so long. These are folks that weren't doing 360s in the 90s when they were like 120 questions that were just tedious. Of course, they were in paper then too, so it's a whole different story. But yeah, in 70 questions, 4 to 5 questions per competency, you can get a full range, well measured on leadership. What we see is that when you start doing shorter surveys, it's quick and easy for raters. But when a leader gets the feedback, they've gone through this whole process, it just falls a little bit short. It just doesn't really give them the depth and breadth that they need to do an authentic look at themselves as leaders, to think about, where do I need to develop? Where do I need to grow? How can I be better? A too short survey will actually, ironically, kind of demotivate them. Our data suggests that the average length is about 52 questions. Each company's a little bit different in the way they do it. We're still going to recommend 70 because it gives you the kind of reliable measurement that you need. If you're going to do 12 or so competencies, that's going to get you just about the right number. But going too short, certainly too long can be cumbersome, but too short is going to be a real problem too. We often get asked the question, well, 70 questions, how long does that take to fill out? We've done some time studies, and it's somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes to fill out that survey. Now, the open-ended portion, which we recommend you really only do 2 questions, what can they do better? What are they doing great? You could add a third in, any other, something like that. But over too many open-ended is really challenging, because that's where it takes time. So we'll see 4 or 5 times as much time spent on writing out open-ended feedback, which can be valuable, but it's also discretionary. I can write 2 sentences, or I can write a paragraph, and the paragraph's going to just take a lot longer. But the number of quantitative questions actually doesn't have a huge impact on the amount of time it takes if you're using a nice, clean, simple rating scale, and those items are clear. Listens to others attentively. It's not a full paragraph that I'm going to look at and then rewind and reread. Listens to others attentively. Dale does that, doesn't do that. How well does he do it? Whatever your rating scale is. So short surveys are good. Don't go too short. Clearly, too long is not usually a trouble, because people are not going to fill out a 120 item survey, and you don't need that many items to measure leadership thoroughly. But don't go through the whole process and leave your leaders wanting more at the end, because that's the moment where change is really going to happen. So make sure they've got enough richness to really do a deep dive. It's not something you're going to do every week, so take the time, do it right, make it the right length. I hit on this before, and most people recognize it, but I can't overstate the importance of anonymity. So, our response to the survey were very clear, that they felt that anonymity was just an essential part of the process. And I would argue this probably should be 100%. You just can't get honest feedback as a leader. It's super, super difficult. And so anonymous feedback, people are going to tell you what they think. You're going to get a lot more credible data. And so you want to take those steps to make sure it's anonymous. So some simple things you can do is around the number of raters, for example, that are required to report the data. So for instance, in our benchmark study, we asked, what are the minimum number of raters per category for someone to be able to show data in the report? So this would be that, think back to our example, we had 5 direct reports. If you only have 2 people respond, less than 8% of the companies, or I guess if I added up, less than 11% of the companies are going to allow the average score there to appear. They're going to just say no data. almost everyone's requiring 3 raters in that rater group in order to report the data, because at 3 it starts to get almost impossible to re-engineer who said what. And so it just feels like that's the right number to get the kind of anonymity that you need and to protect those raters. Obviously, 1 doesn't work so well. It's worth pointing out managers don't get this luxury, right? Welcome to being a manager. Your data is going to be reported. Your average score is going to be reported. They're going to know that you gave a 2 or a 1 or a 5 or whatever. So yeah, you want to make sure that you've taken steps. There's more, but this is like kind of the core of what you need to do for anonymity, is to make sure you use at least a minimum of 3. Above that, you start losing feedback, I will say. So if you go, oh, let's make it really anonymous. Let's say a minimum of 7. Well, minimum of 7, that example that we used before, he didn't have a single rater group with 7 people even invited. So it's very difficult in that context. So 3 seems to be kind of the sweet spot for giving you enough feedback, but also keeping it anonymous. Other steps you can take, make sure you message to people, hey, this is anonymous. Nobody will know who said what. Nobody will know what your individual rating is. Obviously, the vendor's going to know, but we are, for example, contractually obligated with our clients. We put it in the contract. We will not tell you who said what, and you can go to the bank with that. So that's a pretty cool key tool, and you need to be using that tool and others to message to others. Usually it's the second, third time around that people really get it and go, oh, this really is anonymous, and they feel more comfortable and they can really let go. All right, my last tip, if you will, or last kind of best practice is around what you do with the feedback. All too often, as I mentioned before, people collect the data, they put all the work into designing the process, getting the survey right, collecting the anonymous data, putting in a report that makes sense, distributing the report out to people, telling them they need to get a development plan together, and then they stop. And what we find is that follow-up piece is super important. Using the data is critical. So we see coaching as a key ingredient. And I would say here, when I say coaching, it's really what we call feedback coaching versus, say, executive or more extensive leadership coaching, right? So leadership coaching is typically sort of a 6-month engagement. You're working with somebody on a core area over time, repeated cycles. You tend to get access to them, to that coach whenever you need it. This is a little different. This is just saying, hey, let's give you an hour with someone who doesn't have an agenda other than you understanding the feedback and being able to create a plan to change. That's all they're going to focus on. And then you get someone who can do that, who can really come in and say, all right, well, what'd you learn from your feedback? Let's figure out what you need to be developing, and not necessarily granular at every single item, because that can, really lose the big message. But a good feedback coach in an hour can get you to understand what are those 1 to 3 key areas that you need to develop. How is it that you can improve based on this feedback? And in some cases, it's understanding that feedback may come from folks that are in a different place. Maybe your direct reports are saying, maybe a group of direct reports who've all been, poor performers, are really struggling and not very happy with that leader. Well, coach can put that in context and help a leader understand how to use it and what to do with it. So a huge preponderance of our respondents are saying, yeah, it's an essential part of the process. Wouldn't it be nice to have a coach, but like essential part of the process. When we ask the same question and look at percentages of what percentage of companies actually just make it available, we see a pretty consistent high percentage cutting across the years that we've been doing this. It really spiked last year. Not sure whether I think it may have been sort of pandemic related, in the sense that leaders needed a lot more support coming out of that period of time. But pretty consistently, 2/3 of the companies are saying, yeah, we at least make it available. Whether they do it or not is a different thing, and we certainly don't, or may not require it. But it's a pretty key component. So as you're looking at that broad arc of all the things you're trying to design into your process, highly recommend that you factor in coaching. I've even seen companies kind of weigh the question of, well, are we going to give 100 people feedback without coaching, or are we going to give 30 people feedback with coaching? That's a very tough call. Candidly, depending on your environment, depending on how good their managers are, if their managers are going to be really good at helping them understand what to do and use the tool to grow and develop, then maybe you go for the 100 because you get bigger breadth. If not, and they're not going to have a lot of support, I might go for the 30 and get bigger impact with those 30 and just make sure they're the right 30. Tough call, going to be different by organization, but I absolutely would put coaching into the conversation to try to see where you're going to get your greatest impact. All right, this cake's making me hungry. I got to move on. A quick just overview. All right, so what are these? What are the key best practices that I just covered? So be clear about purpose. Make sure people understand why you're doing this. The reputation of your 360 feedback is one of the most impactful things that you want to try to manage, and make sure people understand why they're doing it, what they can get out of it. And again, regardless of where that is, just be clear and transparent. Getting senior leadership support, really important. It's going to give you a tailwind, but it also can be a big lever, particularly if you're thinking about driving culture. You can work with senior leadership to figure out, well, what is our strategy? What is the culture you'd like to see? What behaviors can we put into our survey? Don't make it too long. Don't make it too short. Don't leave those leaders wanting more. Make sure you give them enough substance that they can really dig into their own development. Anonymity, message it, design it, but recognize that if people don't feel like it's anonymous, the quality of the feedback is not going to be there, and the leaders will suffer for not getting that honest feedback they deserve. And then lastly, consider feedback coaching, and how that can fit into your program. Again, no one answer there, but it can be an incredibly powerful tool, and I would say at least making it available is a good idea. I'm going to throw one more little bit of data at you in terms of what the 360 process sort of looks like, the future of 360 feedback, so to speak. When we ask people at the very end of our survey, well, what do you think in the coming year? Do you see yourself doing more? Do you see yourself doing less? Clearly, it's kind of more or the same, and so people really are seeing this as a value-added tool. I firmly believe that companies, I'll say, rarely invest in things again and again that don't give them value. So what we see is quite a bit of growth in the space, and a lot of leaders that are seeing new and better ways to lever the tool to help the organization improve. All right, so those are the slides I've got prepared. I hope there are questions. Happy to field them. Did we get any questions as we went, Jesse?
Yes, I have a few here, and as Dale mentioned, we still have time to take a couple more. So the first one, is 360 feedback the best method available for leader feedback? How does it compare to other types of feedback tools that are out there?
I love that question. I love it so much. I wrote a book chapter on it. So I mean, there's a little bit of, let's be honest, you're a little bit of, Carpenter being asked if something's a nail because he's holding a hammer. I would say yes. I would say 360 is the best feedback tool out there. There are others. Again, I mentioned the stakeholder interviews. Nothing wrong with those. Those can be valuable, but there are some limitations. There are, for a while, companies were experimenting with these like anytime feedback app kind of things that sounded all WYSIWYG and great. The data sort of show, we've seen many, many, many examples of people sort of building those in where you can just, give people feedback anytime. People don't want to do that. People, it's like they're busy doing their jobs. They don't want to spend, they're just not going to remember to do it. And the other piece with that is that what we found was people actually don't need feedback like every day or every week. It's just too much. They need it periodically so they can try to develop and really create a plan. But like constantly be giving feedback, you're like, which way do I go? Which way do I go? So it's a little messy. And then the quality of the feedback tends to almost always be positive. It's a lot of attaboys and not enough constructive. So those methodologies don't seem to have worked as kind of cool as they seemed because I got feedback in my pocket. Yeah, and then other than that, we live in a world where getting feedback's tough. If you're working from home, I mean, remote work's pretty big these days. it's hard to get feedback. So I don't see a lot of other alternatives that are out there that are any better.
Okay, Nader had his hand up and now wrote in a question, so I'll just go ahead and read it.
Okay.
How often would you do 360 feedback to compare results and assess behavior changes?
I wrote an article on that too. Yeah. So um, there's a lot in there. So I recommend doing 360s once a year or once every other year. Depends on your experience, a lot of how much change have you had in your role. But that cadence is enough that you're getting kind of regular feedback. You're regularly thinking about how can I be a better leader. I think every 2 years is the median of what we find in our data in our benchmark study. Um, we actually have a white paper. We can send it to you about the sort of 7 core reasons not to do a pre-post 360 hoping for change. Change scores don't, I mean, there's 7 core reasons listed in there. I won't go into all of them, but change scores don't tend to work particularly well. And one of the key of those key 7 areas or reasons is you end up with different raters. So we know it's a small sample. You might have 10 people filling out a survey. If only 4 of them overlap from the prior implementation, rater effects are real, right? Some people tend to rate really high, some people tend in the middle road, some people tend to be a little harder at raters. So if you're comparing, it's just like, oh, I just ended up with the different raters. That's what actually happened. Did I actually change? I really worked on this. Okay, but I only had 4 raters that overlap. So there's a few kind of very technical reasons why that's not a good idea, as much as it seems like a good idea. So highly, I don't recommend it. We've seen people do that for attempt it and for like large groups and things. It tends to cause problems as much as it seems like it would be logical. Yeah, take a look at that technical report. It's pretty detailed, but I don't recommend doing that pre-post. And if you do, be very cautious and make sure you look at the matching data.
Okay, Rebecca just asked if she could receive a copy of that white paper. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Anyone can message me here or email us after, and we'd be happy to send you a copy of that.
Mhm.
Wendy asked if it's a good idea to include contract workers as raters or if there are any issues you've seen there.
Yeah, I mean, no issues from our perspective. I think, I know there are some systems out there that sort of limit that. I don't really understand why you would do that, but yeah, I think I look at it as, I mean, I've seen customers included, I look at it as who observes that leader in their role that knows how they're working and can contribute to them being a better leader. If you're leading a group of contract workers, well, and hearing their feedback is going to help you be the best leader you can be to help drive their performance better. Absolutely. Why not? Why wouldn't you do that?
Okay. Um, the next one is what's the typical size to conduct 360s? I'm guessing maybe they mean size of the organization. Some
Oh,
people are worried to complete 360 because the group is small and the recipient can find out who is giving the feedback and which
right.
makes them reluctant to give feedback. So I think you
Yeah.
sort of addressed that, but
Yeah. So a minimum of 3, right? Make sure that you've got at least 3 respondents to provide that feedback. So occasionally you'll run into a leader, say, that only has 2 direct reports. Unfortunately, that's just not a good opportunity for using 360s. Much as I'd love to say it's perfect for everybody, you don't get the anonymity you need. So if you have a leader that has that, you're going to need a different methodology, and it might be interviews. Um, but with more than those 2, with multiple folks. Um, so yeah, there are some circumstances where it's not a good tool because you can't achieve the level of anonymity that you need. And I would say also I'm detecting in that question maybe there's some cultural things or some prior issues of trust and worry about vindictiveness. Like I'd be pretty careful in those and try to work through some of those issues. You can do it if you got the right coach and the right circumstance and you set it up right, but if there's mistrust, it can really kind of blow up on you. I would be a little bit more careful in those situations. And so yeah, as long as you get minimum of 3 responses, though, other than that, the trust issues, then yeah, you should have enough data to get you there. I've seen it done with 3 direct reports, 3 peers, 1 manager self, end of story. So that I guess would be the minimum.
Another sort of follow-up question on measuring improvements. Related to the above question, your response, what would be a good way to measure the improvements, if any? What do you recommend to people trying to show value of the program?
Yep, common question, difficult task, basically. It's hard enough to measure leadership, but then measuring change in leadership, also very tricky. The simple answer is have each leader identify what is it that they're changing, what is it that they're working on, and then ask the specific raters that they, the same raters that we gave them feedback, have you seen this change? Because one of the other things in that article that I wrote is it isn't necessarily the specific items that are going to change. It's a little funny, but you might have 3 or 4 items from 2 different competencies that all kind of come together from one rater group to go, oh, you know what? I just need to spend more time with my direct reports, supporting them and letting them know that I'm available to help guide them in what they're doing. And it may be that those little individual behaviors aren't gonna tell the story in the same way as whatever that development goal is in writ large. And that writing up the development, so the way you measure it is you write up the development goal and then you ask people, hey, is this person supporting you more now? Have you seen change? It's direct, but it does tend to work, and people tend to be able to rate that. It's also very laborious and complex because you've got each person has their own. In effect, if you try to do it as a survey, each individual person has their own survey, which is that question about what they're trying to change. So it can be a little bit of a manual effort, but it's that's the way I've seen it done best. And you can get anecdotes from that as well. You can get, kind of a rating. How much have they changed? A lot, a little? Have they regressed? Some of the Marshall Goldsmith study, he's got a article he wrote called "Leadership as a Contact Sport" that gives an example of how this can be done, and shows the conclusion there is, by the way, that the best way to get change is to commit to that development goal and then tell the people that you heard it from that you're going to go work on it and then go do it. And then he asked them later, hey, did you see the change they promised?
Okay. Let's see, we have one or two more. You talked about content fit and customization. What are your thoughts about off-the-shelf content? Are there any advantages to using off-the-shelf content?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I mean, again, it's a sort of situational in terms of what you're trying to achieve. Off-the-shelf content gives you a couple of key things that are often great. One, you often can get development suggestions in the report. So, here your 3 lowest competencies were these, and here's some things you can do to develop those. So that's pretty rich and helpful, supportive kind of guidance, giving people some ideas of what they might be able to do to address those competencies. You also can often get normative scores, so you get a comparison to say, oh, actually a 4 on this is not really as good as I thought it was on a 5-point scale, because most everybody gets a 4.5, right? So there's a little bit of level setting that can happen in that. Frankly, there's a little bit of cost benefit and time to launch benefit. It can be difficult and time consuming to build custom content, and it just may not be worth it. It may be that really the value is you're just looking at kind of core leadership. You're not trying to move the culture. You're just trying to get people focused on how can I improve and create a feedback culture. If you're trying to create a feedback culture, the specific content may not be as critical, and most well-built leadership models for 360s are going to cover the breadth of those things. It just might not be like in the language, or as I mentioned before, like the values of the company. So off the shelf can work for the right purpose, right? That's the first recommendation, is be clear about purpose. Trying to change the culture, don't use an off-the-shelf tool. Trying to build a feedback culture and get leaders focused on development and don't want to distract them with customization and all the time it takes to do that, off the shelf can be great.
Okay, and the last one I have here is what prevents bias in feedback results?
Mm. Yeah, Walt Tornow in 1994 wrote a great article about the idea that there kind of is no bias. In fact, or there is, it's all bias is maybe another way to say it. So you're trying to capture bias. So like think again about my image of what 360 feedback is and that other group in the right corner. and you had the three happy people and that one like screaming mad guy, right? So if they all do ratings, the screaming mad guy is going to provide lower scores. Is he biased, or does he just have an opinion, and that opinion is valuable and worth understanding? I would argue that his opinion is valuable and worth understanding. Maybe he's the one you're not listening to. Maybe he's the one you're not following up with, and that's actually the voice you do need to listen to. So, yeah, I would contend that it isn't bias; it's perspective, and you need to understand it as a leader and use that understanding to help improve. And it may be that that person's way off base, and you need to be in a conversation with them and say, hey, I hear you're really unhappy with this, but let's work through, like, I'm not sure where that's coming from. Let's try to work on, where that perspective is coming, where your perspective is, and what I can do to help you, join the team, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's pretty clear, I think, that that perspective is what you're trying to understand, and it doesn't necessarily show up as bias.
Okay, thank you so much, Dale. Thank you all again for joining us today. Stay tuned for more information about our 8th edition of the benchmark study. It's going to be coming out in January. And if you'd like to talk to our team about how feedback can support your talent goals, please reach out to us. Thank you all again and have a great rest of your day.
Great questions. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.